Till the whole world hears, till the whole world knows.
Hi, and welcome to this edition of Basic Training here at the Back to Basics Radio Ministry website. I'm your host, Broderson, and we're continuing our series today, and we're still talking about the subject of church planting, and I have today here in the studio with me my really good friend, because I say my good friend when I introduce these guys, but this is my specially good friend, Joey Buran. And Joey and I have been friends for lots and lots of years, and we've been in ministry together for lots of years. And I'm excited to have Joey with us today because Joey has planted actually 3 separate churches and been involved in a ton of different ministry. And so I think it's going to be exciting having him. So Joe, thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Brian. I'm stoked.
Okay, so you just told us a few minutes ago, Joey, that you actually taught a church planting class one time some years ago, and the guys who came to the class thought that it was going to be on what subject?
Church landscaping. I actually had some people think it was church landscaping.
That's great.
Yeah, I actually had people that didn't come to the class because they weren't interested in church landscaping.
Well, we're in a new age, and people understand now that we're not talking about church planting in the sense of landscaping. We're talking about starting churches in different places. And, you know, Joe, we've done several of these so far, and actually I noticed that we'd only done guys who were outside of the U.S., guys who have planted either in their own country or guys who have been missionary pastors. So I really wanted to get in a few guys that had done stuff, you know, here in the U.S. And so, Joe, you planted a church in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Correct. You planted a church in Burlington, Vermont.
Yes.
And you most recently planted a church here in Fountain Valley, California.
That's quite a variety pack right there.
That is. It's quite a diverse locations there anyway. So let's talk about those. And I remember, you know, quite a bit myself because we were involved together in those church plants, but it was 1991. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So 1991, you're on staff with me. We're serving together, and God's putting on your heart Virginia.
Right.
And specifically Virginia Beach. So just, you know, give a quick kind of a synopsis of how that all developed.
Well, first of all, in general, all 3 church plants had common denominators, which as you would agree, all of them do, but all 3 of them are very unique as to where I was in life as a pastor, as well as my family and my kids, my wife and my kids, and even geographically. So there was variation, just like when you read the Gospel of John when you first get saved, then you read it 20 years later. It's, you know, so I've learned through each of the 3 church plants different things, common things, and God met me in all of those church plants while he was working in me and through me and my family. And yet there is distinction. So there's commonality with it all, and then there's distinctions with each one. Virginia Beach is a very special church plant because, of course, it was the first one, and I didn't really, when I got to Virginia Beach, there was a postcard. It was Robert E. Lee quote, and it said, "Those young men most eager to go to war are the ones who've never been." And God used that postcard to show me that I was very eager to be the senior pastor, but I wasn't quite sure what I was really getting into. And it was all part of his process. So it's a battle. And I taught the other night at church, and I just said, life is either a battleground or it's a playground. And it's a serious calling. And, you know, we're called to guard what's entrusted to us, O Timothy. And so when I went to Virginia, I was 29 years of age for the first service, and then I turned 30 in that first month of the church. And it was in the Bible Belt. So the very, you know, when we say Bible Belt, we mean the South in America, the traditional, most people go to church, suit and tie kind of a thing. And this is Calvary Chapel in 1991. This is really before the seeker movement took off. So the idea of a church in a shopping center was very foreign in the Bible Belt in 1991. So I was a kind of a prototype Calvary Chapel guy, cutting my teeth in an uncharted area representing Calvary. People were not familiar with the Calvary Chapel movement. They were familiar with Jesus and the Bible in that sense, but the philosophy of ministry that I learned from you and Pastor Chuck was something unknown really in that region. So when we started the church, I didn't realize it, but over the first year it became clear that I was representing that philosophy of ministry in my leadership style. How I raised up leadership, how I equipped them, how I interacted with them, was I available to them, how I was with the congregation, and how I followed up on ministry, things like that. So the philosophy of the Calvary ministry was being imparted to the people in the Hampton Roads area, the Tidewater area, through me. Yeah. And I could have never foreseen that when we first went back. I'm like, well, you know, I've got the Chuck tape series. It was cassette tapes too. And I had the Harvest book, and it was brand new. And I had a dove that wasn't even a Calvary dove. Remember you came and visited, and you said, that's not a Calvary dove, that's a Pentecostal dove. And I was like, I had to change my dove after that. But I just was so gung-ho in my faith, and we were excited. We moved 3,000 miles, and we started that church. Now, what was unique about Virginia is this. That came through prayer. I was asked to pray for Jackie Yockey, who you know, right, the 700 Club. In '89, she asked me to pray about someone starting a Calvary back there in that area. And I still remember when I first prayed for that prayer, when I came back from doing outreaches in Virginia Beach with the surf movie Sunriders. Yeah. I believe I heard the voice of the Lord say to me, you are the guy. Yeah. And I came to you about a year later, and I said, Brian, this has been in my heart for over a year. And you said, well, you know, you should maybe serve here for 3 years, that's sort of Jesus and the Apostle style, and then we'll see what the Lord does. And then that's how it began. The call to Virginia began through interceding for a need for a Calvary Chapel type of ministry. And the Lord, the very first time, spoke to me, I was the one. And I held fast to that, and you encouraged me in that, and you equipped me in that. And that's how it all began. Of course, there's a lot more to it. Yeah. But when it was all said and done, there in February of 1991, when my oldest daughter, Hannah, wasn't even 1 yet, we were there starting that church. And we did that for 4 years. It was a wonderful experience. You had local people, you had military families from the Atlantic Fleet, the various Marine Corps bases in the area, a lot of military, people coming and going, and this type of ministries we get with Camp Pendleton here, you know, people kind of drawn back because they're always saying goodbye. Yeah. So those were sort of the dynamics in Virginia Beach, and probably if I could summarize it best from what I learned as a Calvary Chapel pastor, is people love to hear the Bible taught. Mm-hmm. To not have a topical message where you're trying to cut and paste Bible verses, but to go through Matthew, to go through Revelation, to go through Genesis. People, the common people, as it said in Mark, heard Jesus gladly. And I found that the religious elite, I didn't do too well with them, but the common people heard me gladly. And when I went to the pastor meetings, they'd all be in suits and I'd be in a Billabong collar shirt. So I kind of knew I wasn't quite like the others. But the people came, and one thing that pastors would run into in that kind of situation that I would impart to them, that I've learned when you go into a place like that as an outsider or a West Coast guy, and even now, 20 plus years later, I'd say it's the same, is that when people become a part of your ministry, if they come from denominational backgrounds, the family, the extended family, sees it as something kind of sketchy. Mm-hmm. They're not sure about it. Like, you know, your grandfather was a Methodist, your great-great-grandfather was on the board at the First Baptist Church, and those are all fine ministries, but they somehow, so a lot of times when people get involved with a Calvary Chapel or just a community church that teaches the word verse by verse, that type of thing, the traditional denominational background was something that you find families that didn't fit into that, but when they got excited about the Lord through the ministry of Calvary Chapel in Virginia, their family members, other family members would give them a hard time and say, what, our church isn't good enough for you? And so you ran into those kind of things that were a little, you know, just, you felt like you're constantly trying to defend not the faith so much, but just the philosophy of ministry. Defend teaching the Bible, right? You know, and so that's what I really learned in Virginia Beach, because if I had to summarize Virginia Beach, it was a religious area. Yeah. And so it seemed like I was always having to defend something in the Bible, or have to dispute some doctrine or aberrational thing, and it just, it was worrisome. Yeah. It grew tiresome, but I learned how to stay on track with the ministry, with the people that I did have ministry with, discern their ministry needs and how to serve them, and leave a fruitful church for someone else to pastor. Yeah.
So you went, okay, so Virginia Beach, Bible Belt, lots of people coming from denominational backgrounds, 4 years, you learned a lot. You go from there to like the diametrically opposite situation, when you move up to Vermont, New England, the most liberal, unchurched part of the country, really, still to this day, even. So, I mean, this is like a full-blown cultural, shift. This is culture shock, really.
Yes, and it's worth mentioning how I felt we were and believed, because the feelings don't matter. It's how I believed we were called to Vermont, and then what the difference was. The way the call to Vermont came is I had sensed that my season in Virginia was coming to an end. And I was a go-getter and still am. And I just looked at from the Calvary Chapel movement's perspective. When we started the church in Virginia Beach, there was one Calvary in the state of Virginia. Actually two, Fredericksburg and DC area. So I had a vision for Calvaries to kind of impact the mid-Atlantic. But then when I went to New England, I looked at New England, and it's like Paul said in Romans 15, I made it my aim to take the gospel where it's not been. And I thought, I've been in the land of religion for 4 years. I'd like to go where it's just, you just go for it. And all you have to do is look at a map and realize, like you said, New England, hey, go get them, And so we went up there. We took a trip after our third child, Timothy, was born. Jennifer and I, with Hannah and Leah, we drove up there for a vacation. And I was like, I think it was sort of a kind of see what the Lord might do. But it was in Montpelier, Vermont, where I saw a teenage kid with a group of kids and a church steeple in the background. And we felt the oppression as soon as we got to New England. The worst demonic attack I've ever had in my sleep, and I've had a lot of them, was in Providence, Rhode Island the night before. So I have a gauge just how dark and oppressive it was as you got up there. But I looked at this kid, and I believe the Lord spoke to me, who's going to reach him with the gospel? And it was this image of this kid with the church steeple behind him, because it's all the beautiful postcard church steeples, but they don't teach the Bible. Most of them do not at all, or even believe it, let alone believe it. So that vision would not go away from me. And eventually, as you know, being involved with the whole process, in a bad market, we needed to sell our house. That was the confirmation, and our house sold in a terrible market at the full price we needed. And it gave my wife, as you know, Jennifer, peace about moving to Vermont. We were leaving a fruitful work, church of about 400 or 500 people, to go to the unknown. And unlike when we went to Virginia, where you as a sending church gave us 6 months for the facility, 3 months for the pastoral ministry, it was like, here's, a couple dollars and, rock the house kind of a thing. And it was good, because that's what we needed. And so it was the vision of this kid that was lost in the vision of the gospel in that region for the churches. That's what stirred us, and that put it in motion. So to cut to the quick, when we got to Vermont, it was very different in that in Virginia, although Calvary Chapel was not an established ministry, there was enough people through the military, especially the Navy, people that had been at Mike McIntosh's church or Ray Bentley's church through the Pacific Fleet, they come to the Atlantic Fleet. So there was a base of people that somewhat knew who you were. In Vermont, nobody knew Calvary Chapel, hardly at all. They don't even, I can say to this day, I never met an unsaved person that I shared the gospel with that had ever heard the gospel before, the entire 15 months I lived in Vermont. Yeah. It was so dark. So you couldn't fall back on Pastor Chuck or the Dove or anything. There was no word for today. There was nothing. Yeah. It was just like, hey, this is it.
They'd hardly even heard of Jesus, let alone
right.
Chuck or Calvary.
Right. And unfortunately for me and for those who represent Christ in that part of the country, they so associate a Christian with the religious right or the Republican Party and things like that, and they're very liberal, so they want to go on politics when you want to go on salvation. They want to talk temporal, political issues, and we want to talk eternal, spiritual issues. Yeah. So it's much like the Gospel of John, where Jesus is always like, this is your world. You drink from this water, you'll thirst again. This is my world. Yeah. So there's always this challenge to try and get past this political stereotyping of a Christian, and how that put walls up with the people of Vermont. Yeah. Yeah. And in the case of Vermont, we did take out an ad in the paper about a Calvary Chapel in the Burlington Free Press. Just say, if there's anyone out there, Radio Free Europe, here we are. And actually some people came through that. But I went door to door inviting people to church. I went to the city square. I went all these places trying to encourage people to come to church. And it was quite humbling, to say the least. And then I had to work a regular job the entire time I was there for minimum wage. And at the age of 34, that was, although you always say I'm ready for that, you really aren't. And that was quite humbling too.
Yeah. And yet, despite all of that, kind of the negative side of it, the difficult side of it, and there were many more challenging things, God did plant a little church there.
Yeah.
And you were able to, lay a foundation. You were able to pass it on to somebody else. And I think looking back now, Joey, like you said, we kind of, spearheaded a little bit into Virginia. There were a couple, Fredericksburg and D.C. area. Right. And then, but a lot of churches in Virginia now, and I think that that was kind of a catalyst for much of what ended up happening with, today we look at Newport News. That was a direct
Tony
result.
Clark, Troy Warner, yes.
Troy Warner going to Lynchburg, again, connected to the fact that you went there. And then, going up even into New England. And, it's interesting because right now, I've been reading little things here and there where, people are talking like revival in New England right now. Like there's stuff happening in New England that hasn't happened since the Puritan days, So you had a little part in that. Now, just to kind of fast forward here, of course, you came out of professional surfing originally, Pipemaster Champion 84, and all of that stuff you did. Went into ministry for all those years. You feel God calling you from Vermont back to California. You come back to California, but not immediately into pastoral ministry. You kind of go back into the surf world. You win the 98, was it 98 yes. World Masters Championship. And you're kind of back in that world and ministering and evangelizing and doing this and that. And then eventually the Lord opens the door for you to come back into ministry. You come with me here. You're with me on staff here for 5 years doing worship generation. And then boom, the Lord kind of launches you out again to a more local thing here with worship generation. And now you've been going 5 years there, right?
Right, yeah. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, each church, it's where I was in my life. 29, I'm planting a church in the Bible Belt. 34, I'm planting a church in New England, going door to door and realizing what it's like to be rejected for Jesus. But it is very important to say, by faith, God did do a great work in Vermont, and both those churches still exist, the one in Virginia and the one in Vermont. Yeah. And they're fruitful. Yeah. But what I learned in Vermont is how to minister to non-believers. Yeah. Not the Christianese type of thing of the Bible, but non-believers. And so it was really God working in me at the age of 34. Will you like Jesus to Peter, do you love me more than these? And it was just, that was something more in me than through me. Yeah. But I learned from Vermont, God will honor steps of faith. Yeah. And if we let him work in us, then he's going to work through us. Yeah. Now, fast forwarding to here, think now the situation for me here in Orange County, because I did worship generation in the sanctuary for 5 years here, and with Chuck's blessing, your blessing, and it was awesome. And as a college ministry, and as we've seen with Garrett Beeler and his ministry, who obviously God raised up to replace me, it's always in motion. People are coming and going, and we came to the point, myself and Jennifer, that there's something else that God has for us. And we prayed about a lot of things, as you know, because you were involved in all this. But in the end, really believe that we were called to reach a younger generation and go to a part of Orange County maybe where there wasn't a Calvary. So we chose Fountain Valley. And it's been quite an experience, because I tell people, okay, after Virginia and Vermont, now we're in Orange County. And what I got, like when we went to Vermont, people were like, why would you ever do that? Okay. And when we started the church in Orange County, people were like, why would you ever do that? But for different reasons. And I remember someone saying to me, there's 40 Calvary chapels in Orange County. And I would have to say, there's 3 million people. Yeah. And even as I've talked about what the Lord could do in the future, you're like, oh, we need more Calvaries in Orange County. So stepping out, that was a different type of thing where we just turned everything over to Garrett and waited on the Lord for a couple months and ended up at Shoreline Baptist Church using the facility. And now we're going on 6 years, coming up on 6 years. So it's very interesting because we're a Calvary chapel called Worship Generation.
Meeting on a Baptist church
on Saturday night. So it's been, we still have that outreach feel. And Brian, you know me a long time, and I know I'm called as a pastor. And, but probably if I was a baseball pitcher and your go-to pitch, if I'm Mine would be exhortation.
Yeah.
It's always in my strength to stir people up with vision and to go for it. And I have found in 6 years being in Orange County in this area that God just brings people randomly that need to be encouraged and stirred up. And it's not like I've tried to build this big club, you know, the Joey Church Club thing. I've just tried to be faithful each week. Yeah. And I've gotten, as you would know, as I've gotten older, as we all do, you realize it's the Lord. It's from the Lord, it's of the Lord, and it's for the Lord. So, you know, I've pastored a church of a few hundred people. Yeah. They've changed every few years, and the devil's always like, what are you doing? I'm like, I just keep teaching the word, and I try and serve them in whatever the Lord has. So the third church plant has been, in its own way, very unique and different than the other two. But what I've really learned in the third church plant is just to be faithful in the moment. Yeah. And I've come to a peace that I can be the pastor of a church, and I can do the outreach evangelism, like you mentioned with the surf community, stuff like that. I somehow always play them against each other, and I just come to a peace that, you know, they're like the 5 and the 405. They're going the same direction, and they'll meet. So at the age of 50, God, those are the gleanings of 3 church plants.
You look so good for 50. Nobody would ever guess that you're 50. But, you know, just in closing, and I think, too, you know, that's so true. I mean, God's, you know, I think, and like you said, you've kind of come to that acceptance in your life that God's kind of got you in 2 worlds right now. And you're still in the surf world. You're still, you know, coaching. You're sought after. You know, there's all kinds of great things happening there, which is really exciting. And for Orange County, like you said, there's 3 million people here. And I know that this is kind of a destination. Some other church planners are looking to come in, and it's like, hey, you know, more power to them. We need more gospel-centered churches. And so we'll see what the Lord does in the days ahead. Thanks for being here.
Yes, Brian. Well, thank you. And thus far in my life, I know what it's like to plant 3 churches. I do not know what it's like to do one overseas, and I don't know what it's like to take one over and fix it. So we'll see what the Lord has the rest of the journey.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to being with you with another church planting session in the future. God bless you.
We'll send us out with you.